is also very unusual for any kind of vaccine policy to be emanating from the White House. In general, there are committees that exist within the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, the nation's top public health agency. There are committees there that evaluate the science around vaccines and then vote on recommendations. That committee has actually been replaced with a lot of vaccine skeptics under RFK Jr.
We're still reeling over the maddest story of the day. Donald Trump hidden in a catering truck. Was he between the sandwiches and the beef bourguignon? We'll never know, will we, exactly how his placement was. It was initially reported, wasn't it, as a catering cart, which just made me think of sort of those kind of food trolleys that sort of go around hospitals and drop off food. And just the image of Donald Trump, sandwiched between a couple of trays with a juice carton sort of sticking out of his left ear came to light. But it was a catering truck, and there is a serious side to this, I suppose, that is quite a dramatic ruse, presumably warranted by the size of the threat.
That's precisely the case. I think that for the White House, and I think for Secret Service in particular, to secretly put President Trump on a smaller plane while reporters and some staff who had been traveling with him were on the older Air Force One jet, it really emphasizes the severity, or at least indicates that the severity of this alleged Iranian assassination plot against President Trump was such that they had to take such extraordinary measures. At the same time, it's also raised these questions about the White House's transparency to the public about the president's whereabouts and movements, as well as the decision to have reporters and some staff effectively on a decoy flight with what may have been pretty considerable security risks without their own knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if your colleagues on board that plane, and I think we've had a comment from the White House Correspondents Association, haven't we? How they feel about being left on the compromised jet, the plane where Donald Trump was meant to be travelling on. We now know, of course, he didn't. He took away on a cart and into a smaller plane with Pete Hegseth. But I wonder if they feel let down by the security services here.
Well, I do think that what we've been hearing from White House reporters, and we typically do have someone who's on these trips. Obviously, it depends on who's in the press pool at the time. So sometimes, not everyone from the Wall Street Journal is in the pool and not necessarily on Air Force One. But what we've been hearing, of course, is frustration that there was no one who was made aware of this within the White House Correspondents Association. So obviously there are presidents who have embarked on, flights into war zones or trips into war zones where they have sometimes taken a smaller press pool with them. When there's been a security threat in the past, for example, when former President George W. Bush was dealing with the aftermath of 9/11. There was a slimmed down press pool with him as he flew first to a military base and then back to Washington. So, there's precedent for there being a very challenging and unusual circumstances surrounding the president and perceived threats to his safety. But there's always been communication, even if it's just with the White House Correspondents Association president. There has always been communication with someone within the press in the interest of transparency for the American people.
Yeah, look, those reporters on the plane actually asked Donald Trump why they were being advised to keep their window shades down. And Trump responded by saying it was because they were probably on a dangerous flight, and that's reassuring. He then said, but if I go, you go, right? And then he got off the plane, Sabrina. So not right.
Yeah, I mean, apparently not. And I think that's something that you're hearing a lot of frustration over, is the idea that the security of journalists and staff was potentially compromised. Of course, there's some people are pointing back to, and there's the Washington Post, which broke this extraordinary story, has another follow-up around how there was a similar plane change maneuver in 2000 when President Bill Clinton was traveling from India to Pakistan. But see, this is where, although Clinton was on a separate plane, an unmarked plane, and there was a decoy instead that had all the markings of Air Force One. At the time, White House officials had briefed the White House Correspondents Association president about what was happening, about the dangers involved in flying in the region, and about the use of the decoy plane and some of the dangers that were even there for the journalists who were part of the trip and accompanying President Clinton. So I think just that lack of communication is what is so unusual here, especially just, again, given what appears to be the severity of this threat, that they would have even taken these extraordinary steps in the first place.
All right. OK, let's move on to another bit of news coming out of the US today. Donald Trump has signed an executive order that will split up the highly effective measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, more commonly known as the MMR. That's going to be split into 3 separate jabs. The president also announced an overhaul to the immunisation schedule for children, scrapping the recommendations for hepatitis B, COVID-19 and influenza shots. He also made unfounded and unproven links between inoculations and autism rates.
Effective immediately, my administration is recognizing gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations for only 11 core vaccinations against the most serious and dangerous diseases, along with the MMR, which hopefully will be split up. You have the MMR, we want it in 3 separate vaccinations given at separate times. In addition, this executive order directs the Attorney General to advance legal challenges against states that violate children's rights to religious or medical vaccination exemptions.
Donald Trump there, he also suggested the MMR vaccine could be quite lethal if given at once. Of course, has been given at once over a period of years, and it's given at once in many, many many countries around the world, including the UK. And that hasn't really been questioned. The safety of it and connections to autism, that is something that was dead and buried years ago. Why is it resurfacing in the United States, despite a lack of evidence about whether or not it is linked to autism?
Well, there has been this push by the Trump administration that has been led in large part by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, who has a history of vaccine skepticism and promoting conspiracy theories, especially about the MMR vaccine, to try and pare back the amount of vaccines that children and people in general receive here in the U.S. They've tried in the past as well to overhaul some of those recommendations. RFK Jr. did try to overhaul the childhood vaccine schedule earlier this year, and it got challenged in the courts. I have no doubt that this executive order, which goes even further than that prior effort, would also be challenged legally. And it's just, while it's part of this effort by President Trump and his administration to kind of, in some ways, cater to vaccine skeptics who have become a key part of the Republican base, it's just also very unusual for any kind of vaccine policy to be emanating from the White House. In general, there are committees that exist within the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, the nation's top public health agency. There are committees there that evaluate the science around vaccines and then vote on recommendations. That committee has actually been replaced with a lot of vaccine skeptics under RFK Jr. And I think at this point, it's President Trump, based on our reporting, who has reached somewhat of a tipping point in terms of his, wanting to make changes to vaccine policy. And this was very much him driving, really driving the ship here or steering the ship here, in part because he's wanted RFK Jr. to be able to do more to overhaul vaccines than he's been able to do so far.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth. He's come under fire over appointments to the Pentagon's Defence Policy Board. They include two men with ties to a firm where Donald Trump's son is a partner. The two men work for companies which have already drawn billions in federal loans and contracts since the start of the second Trump administration. Tell us a little bit more about this, Sabrina.
Well, I think for Hegseth, I was tracking a little bit more. I've been reporting more on his pick for the Army Chief of Staff being in jeopardy.
We can absolutely go with that. We can absolutely go with that.
Yeah. There's so much happening with Pete Hegseth right now. It's been a little bit hard to keep track of. Each day it's a different issue. There's obviously Republicans who are signaling that they won't support his controversial pick for Army Chief of Staff because they don't believe that he has the experience or credentials. And then there's some
Who is the pick, Sabrina? Tell us a little more about him if you've been focusing on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your being flexible with me. So the General Christopher Leneve, and he's been actually the acting Army Chief of Staff ever since Hegseth in April fired the former top Army officer, retired General Randy George. And one of the issues with Leneve is that he apparently, according to a lot of Republicans, doesn't have the necessary experience. He's been a four-star general for only 6 months. Typically, most Army chiefs who would serve at least 18 months as a four-star general before assuming the top position. Of course, there's a lot more concerns about this given the fact that the U.S. is still at war with Iran.
Yeah.
And, I think there is also just concern over Leneve. During January 6th, he was serving in the capacity of being one of the liaisons between the Army and the National Guard in Washington. And there are some allegations at the time from the National Guard that Leneve, and it was part of covering up what was an hours-long delay in the Army's response to the January 6th riots at the Capitol. So, if he can't get support from all Republicans who are on the relevant committee, then there's no way that he would be able to make it for his nomination to be able to move forward. The question, of course, will be whether Trump just chooses to keep him as acting chief of staff anyway, which he's been doing in order to bypass the kind of approval you typically need from the Senate.
This is pertinent because we don't know where the war with Iran is going, but in extremis, you could see some sort of US boots on the ground. And in terms of the army, that of course would need a significant collaboration between the Trump administration and whoever is in that position as Army Chief of Staff. Let's talk a little bit, if you've had the message on this one, I hope so, about the FIFA boss, Gianni Infantino, and Donald Trump's Truth Social post about him. I mean, this is the story that won't die. Neither will Donald Trump's loyalty to Infantino, it seems.
No, it simply won't. It's not very surprising in part because of what you say. These two men have developed a very close relationship, and Infantino spent years cozying up to President Trump, and this in some ways is the payoff, because at a time when he is perhaps more embattled than at any other point in his tenure, he does have the backing of, the American president. Now, I don't really know how much that's going to help him, given just the level of the pressure, the amount of pressure that Infantino is under. And I don't think any of the more influential members of the soccer world really are going to give much credence to Trump's endorsement.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's just something that I think goes to show, again, the fruits of Infantino's efforts to really forge this relationship with Trump that we, of course, saw play out in some very controversial ways during this most recent World Cup.
Yeah, thanks to the story broken by the Times' Martin Ziegler here on Home Turf, who's done some terrific work on this. So there you go, Donald Trump posting on Truth Social, telling FIFA they'd be making a terrible mistake if they got rid of Infantino, saying FIFA will never be as successful or profitable again if Infantino is removed from his post. What effect it will have, as you say, negligible. Thank you, Sabrina. Good to have you with us. Sabrina Siddiqui, who's national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal.